There were reports by economists that explained and analyzed in great depth how lockdown was costing more lives than it would save. There were reports by Pfizer itself and Moderna and the other pharmaceutical companies that vaccines would not stop the spreading of the disease. It was completely clear that the mouth caps had the same protective effect of spreading particles of COVID as a tennis net would have to prevent you from being stung by mosquitoes. There is absolutely no disagreement about all these things and so many other things. It's completely, from the start to finish, the whole narrative, all the measures that were implemented, everything that has been done to us was from A to Z completely and totally irrational. It did not make any sense whatsoever. Okay, so that's the starting point. That's where the work really begins. That's where all of us are right now. We are in a situation where we see two things. The first is that completely irrational policies are being implemented. And COVID is only one example, of course. What about the euro currency that Hungary has luckily escaped? But it's a completely and utterly irrational. From an economic perspective, it's a completely irrational thing. Completely irrational. Mass immigration is another thing. The war against Russia, the Ukraine war, it's completely irrational. It doesn't make any sense to do it. The way the traffic is being organized, it's completely irrational. It's so stupid, completely irrational. Modern architecture, it's completely irrational. Wokeism, LGBTism, it's completely irrational. No sensible person, I challenge you to find a single individual who is not paid by the government who defends this transgenderism. There isn't any. So COVID to me, and this is the final sentence, sorry, but COVID to me was I'm just talking a little bit, I think in translation you can shorten it a little bit, but the point is this: COVID was to me was merely a symptom. It was something that made me wake up to something else that's going on in our world, in our society, which is that two things. The first is that we are witnessing completely irrational policies. And the second is that those policies are being implemented across the board in tens of different countries. And that's what led me to the conclusion that I'm going to talk about more, that politicians don't have any power. But I'll explain that later on. Politicians are the people whose job it is to pretend that a rational deliberation is at the basis of policies. The job of people in parliament and parliamentary journalists and members of the government is to give the impression that they are serious people. Their job is to give the impression that they can read books. They cannot read books. That they can process arguments. They can't do that. That they can analyze statistical data and Excel sheets. It's way beyond their IQ. And so their activity consists in pretension. They pretend that they think about things, They pretend that they have exchanges of arguments. And that's also why life in Parliament is so dreadful and so horrible, and why it takes so many boring hours for all these stupid and pointless and senseless debates, which aren't debates. They're not debates. They don't have anything to do with debates. The activity of these people is to pretend. They pretend that they are serious people. They are not. They are social clingers. And I'm not precisely sure if this word translates into English or even into Hungarian, but they go with the flow. They are the same useless people that spend their entire evenings in clubs without getting laid at the end. They're just there, they're just hanging at the bar. That's politicians for you. So in a sense, I suspect you can say that politicians are just like most people. Because most people are socially oriented rather than goal oriented. They are sensitive to social developments rather than to arguments. Most people, if you're in a group trip or you're taking a guided tour in a museum, most people are walking very slowly and it's annoying, it's terrible, right? It's horrible. But that's just, so I think it's important to realize that, this is still the starting point of the book, but it's important to realize that this is what politics is. Politics is nothing else than watching a social happening. It's not an intellectual happening. It's not an analytical happening. It's not about the well-being of the nation or of the people. No, it's a social happening designed at or aimed at defining who is going to get which position. It's not even about policies, because nothing ever changes. It doesn't matter who wins elections, who loses elections. The policies remain the same. We still have disastrous immigration. We still have horrific modern architecture. We still have LGBT rubbish. We're still supporting Israel, whatever happens. We're still in a war with Russia, whatever happens. It's all the same thing, right? It never changes. It doesn't matter who wins elections, who loses elections. So COVID to me was a wake-up call. Apart from all the things that were terrible about it and horrible and unforgivable about it, it meant so much more because it made me see the ridiculous choice of profession I had made. And so in the second part of the book, I describe what that realization has done to me. If I am in a ridiculous profession, if I have a ridiculous job, if I live in a clown world, essentially, with fakers, with actors, with non-tangible people that you could just, you can just press through, I have two options, right? Just leave my party, leave politics alone, and go to some island and sit on the beach and watch the sunset for the rest of my life. Okay, that's option A. I will tell you why I decided not to go for that option and chose option B. And the reason that for at a very deep level I did not, I've always known, and I felt immediately, and I knew that's not the answer, was that it was the same thing as what happens, forgive me the slightly American reference here, but it's the final part. It's a great movie. The final part of the Batman trilogy that Christopher Nolan made. It's called The Dark Knight Rises. Yeah, where Batman a character I greatly identify with, is captured by his great nemesis, by his enemy. And he's not killed. He's not killed by the enemy, by his nemesis, but he is locked up in a prison where he has all these television screens, and he forcibly has to watch the destruction of his city, of Gotham City, which is the city where he's from. And the point is that the greatest punishment for an idealist like he is to have to watch his city go down. That's the point. That's the suffering is not in, just walking away, but the suffering is in the realization that something there that you belong to, that's yours, that your inheritance, where your friends or your family, it's where your history lies, it's going down, and you're not fighting to protect it. So having established that the policies that are implemented in our countries are completely irrational and destructive, and there's no sensible argument to be made, that politicians are essentially actors, just pretending to be powerful, pretending to listen to arguments, and thus concluding that this whole game in Parliament and with journalists and all that stuff, it's all essentially a piece of theater to pretend that people have an influence, to pretend that discussions matter and all that. But also having established that I could not in no way leave my country alone, because I would suffer to death. I would suffer too much not being involved in the fight. I had to transform my party and transform the way I interpreted my job as a politician in a way that it would become meaningful again to me. And that's the final part of the book where I describe that. And so I transformed the party. And I transformed it, and I transformed the way I understood my job in two things. And the first is to expose much more than to see my party and my position in politics as a scramble for power brokers trying to get a little piece of the cake, as it were, to aim for a particular position, or to get as many seats as you can, or to participate in that great game of the mainstream media where who is talking about whom and blah 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 blah. I changed from doing that into exposing how ridiculous, in a sense, all these people are. And the second thing that I started doing, which is also completely new, and I don't think a lot of political people and movements have made that transition, is that I started to reorganize power and influence where it actually lies, which is in society itself. So I started setting up companies. I started setting up a school. We have our own school in the Netherlands. We have a network of farmers. We set up a publishing house, a media house. We've set up a youth movement. We're setting up all these things that actually exist in the physical world. So it's not talk anymore. It's not just motions and legal proposals and arguments in Parliament, which is in a sense a clown show. We're actually doing concrete things for people, and we're organizing power, socio-economic power. We're organizing ourselves. So that meant a very significant shift in the way I understood politics, and I understood my own job, and in the things that my party is actually doing. We are not trying to be part of the club, we're trying to expose the club, and we're not trying to change the game from above, but we're trying to change the game from below. And that's in a way, the beautiful thing that this horrible episode in our lives has taught me, which is that it has put me in a position where I was able to see for the first time how things really work and how ridiculous everything is and what the real ways are in which we can affect change. And that's the paradoxical conclusion of this book, and I think it can be a positive message, but it can also be perceived as a very negative message, because it's always in terms of fear and in terms of division and in terms of control that the political system is trying to further its power, and it's by precisely doing the opposite that we can effectively fight back. So as much as we've seen the futileness in a way of political action, we've also been shown the path towards forms of action that actually can affect very significant change. And I think we've been seeing that all over Europe, and perhaps even beyond that, where people are taking up the initiatives of their own, they're taking control over their lives, they're looking for ways to trade with one another, to look after each other, to organize themselves in a way that's independent from the state, from the powers that have been organizing all these rather terrible things for us and that keep on organizing those wars and all those things. And so for me it's a very mixed message. It's a very ambivalent feeling. I feel very powerless on the one hand, and I feel very powerful on the other hand, and it's very double. And I'm very curious. Maybe we can open the discussion. Maybe Robert can say one or two things if he wants. But this is, I think, this is where we are right now. We're sort of in this middle situation where we've come to this conclusion that, okay, it doesn't really matter who wins elections, who loses elections. You can't convince anyone with the most basic arguments and just exposing fallacies about mortality rates, about vaccines. I mentioned that at the beginning of my talk. It's so obvious. If you hold it in front of politicians' eyes, and there's just absolutely nothing that happens, nothing that registers. They're completely blank. So it's pointless, and that's you could feel desperate about it. But then again, there's this other thing that has started moving, maybe too slowly, maybe sometimes it's way too slow for us, maybe sometimes we're surprised at discovering new friends along the way. But I think this is the road we should all be taking, and this is the path forward, and this is also why I'm so excited to be here in Hungary. I don't speak a word of your language, but we have a great interpreter, of course, and we are reaching out, and I think we should all be trying to reach out, and ultimately I think there's a force there that cannot be stopped. Maybe it will take longer than we hope, but ultimately I'm very positive about the possibilities for the future, and I'm, needless to say, very grateful that you all turned up, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.